You know that it's hard to stick with it, so I appreciate you all being here. So I'm going to talk about what I call pro storyboard techniques. So I work at Martian Craft, and I write code every day. We do iOS apps, Android apps. We do server-side stuff to support those apps as well. And so I mainly focus on iOS stuff. I don't know much about Android. Who all out here is iOS developers? Cool. Any Android developers out there? Cool. Some switch hitters who do both? Right on. Cool. So part of what we do every day is try to make software that's maintainable, right? The CEO of our company likes to describe his philosophy for code as make sure that the code you write, or make sure that the developer who's going to come look at your code, imagine in your mind if they're a psychotic axe murderer and they know where you live. So you want to make sure your code is good and that person doesn't want to come hunt you down, right? So part of what we do is use storyboards, and there's a lot of stuff in storyboards that can really help you write better maintainable code. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. All right, now I'm a little excited. I set up my watch as a remote, and this is the first time I'm using it for real. Did it work? Ah, come on. There we go. Hey, okay, so that's me, Joe Keeley. I live in Denver, Colorado. Work at Martian Craft. We just covered that. And so I was the co-author on this book with Kyle. He's the CEO with Who's Afraid of Axe Murderers. Yeah, and so we wrote this talking about sort of the stuff once you've gotten through the beginnings of iOS. You can take a look at some of the different frameworks that Apple provides. So we've got chapters on all kinds of stuff in there. So spent a lot of time looking at Apple's SDK. All right. And that's my Twitter handle. If you guys have questions later on or anything you want to ask about, hit me up. I'm happy to answer. All right, so let's dive into the storyboard techniques. Technique number 1, use them. Of the developers here, I'm curious to know how many people like to do user interface in code? 1, 2, huh? You hate storyboards. Why? You just don't like them? Have you spent much time with them, or have you spent a lot of time, gotten messed up? Merge conflicts? Merge conflicts. Okay, we're going to talk about merge conflicts in a little bit. So who here uses storyboards regularly? Cool. Who here uses just individual XIB files for your view controllers and stays away from them? Okay, cool. I'm curious why you do the XIBs and not storyboards. Okay, cool. All right, so he's saying he doesn't want to see the navigation, and I argue I like to see the navigation. So, so that's just one of the things we'll talk about here. All right. So what are some reasons for using storyboards? The first and foremost reason, and I just lost my cap. The first and foremost reason for me is to reduce the amount of code in your project. As Laura, did anybody watch Laura talk this morning at the keynote session? Yeah, and she very eloquently described, all the stuff that can happen when you have a lot of code or difficult code in your project, right? It's a lot of cognitive overhead that makes you work when you try to read it and try to figure out what's going on in a project. So storyboards, I feel, are a really good way to reduce the amount of code and simplify the amount of code in your project. If you're spending time building user interface in code and it's not something custom, it's something that could easily be done in a storyboard, I feel that's wasted. I feel like that is something that creates a lot of inventory there in your code that you don't really need. So that's the first reason for me. Second reason is the storyboards can help you map out your app, right? So if you use the navigation or you like to look at it, you can take one glance at a storyboard and get a really good feel for how your screens relate to each other and how you get between them. And this is one thing for me when I pick up a project. A lot of times, we'll take on existing projects that people have built in the past. And if they've used a different technique for doing navigation in an app, and the client will say, okay, well, the first thing we want to do is this really simple, 30-minute change. This one little screen here, we just need to change the font of this one field. Shouldn't take you long at all, right? Well, those are the worst kind of changes to make the first time you're in a new app, because if you don't know the structure of the app, you don't know the navigation, you don't know the naming standards, and you need to try to go find that screen. You have to go dig through and figure out, well, I don't know where the navigation is, so I'll start at the beginning, and I'll read the code, and maybe I do a present view controller, and so I got to go find that view controller, and then go find this view controller, and try to trace it all the way through. And then you have to like set debug points to make sure you're really in the controller that you think you're in. In some cases, that can take a couple of hours just to sort your way through to a view controller to make a really, really simple change. With a storyboard, that problem is mitigated, right? You can take a quick look at that storyboard. You can go, that's the screen, I'll go there. You look up which, you use the inspector, you find out what the view controller is, and then you can go make your change very quickly. So that's one of the reasons that I like being able to map out the app inside a storyboard. It helps you with that kind of problem later on. All right. Outlets and actions. I had good points about this. I better check my notes here. So I like just setting up IB outlets for stuff that's needed. So I don't set up an IB outlet for everything on the screen. So the IB outlets for me are just a quick way to know what's important on the screen, what I need to change, and what I don't need to change. Navigation and segues. So again, I like being able to see the navigation in the storyboard and being able to figure out where things are going. When you're planning out an app, and kind of one of the ways that I build a new app is I like to just map out the entire thing right away without any functionality. So I'll put in stubs or placeholder view controllers for every screen that's in my design, and then wire up that navigation, putting in the basic buttons or whatever else, or the table view selections with segues, so that way I can map out and get to every screen in the app. If I find that the design has indicated some navigation that I can't do with the segue, well, there's a red flag. This is going to take me longer than I thought it would, so I'll go back to the client and say, hey, this custom or this navigation doesn't work the way that Apple prescribes. We're going to have to do some extra work here. Is that what you want? Is it really important? Or should we change the design to make it quick and easy to do? So that can help you sort of identify those situations in your code and avoid potential problems. All right, and last but not least, we talked about maintainability. So again, remember that the next person that looks at this code, you don't want them to hate you. So please do a good job with your code. Make it nice and clean. And hopefully this is a way to help you do that. All right, technique number 2, using segues. So there are 5 general categories of segues. Who uses segues for navigation? Cool, okay. So there's 5 different categories of segues. We've got the show and the show detail. We've got the relationship segue. So that's like for your view controller, like a root view controller and a navigation controller. Or if you've got a tab bar controller, you can set up those relationships for all the tabs, right? The embed view controller is really useful. The unwind view controller, or I'm sorry, the unwind segue, who's used that? Just a couple people. Okay, cool. We're going to talk about that in a little bit of detail. And then manual segues. Who's used manual segues before? A few more people? Cool. So let's talk about some segue basics here. What I like to do in a project is, if I need to run some validations when I'm going from one screen to another, I'll use the should perform segue method to run some validations. And then if I'm like, hey, I can't pass forward, I'll say, no, don't perform my segue. And then I can come back and notify the user that there's something wrong, we need to adjust, we need to fix. And then they can fix it and then continue going through. If validations are asynchronous, so if you have to do something like do an alert view and then wait for the user to respond to it or something like that before proceeding, what I normally do in that case is I'll use a custom method and then do a manual segue using that perform segue with identifier, right? So that's an easy way to do that. And then last but not least, I'll use prepare for segue to set up my destination controller. And really, I only pass the data there. So what I'll typically do is just pass my model object to the next view controller and inject it there, and then let that controller configure itself with the data to display on the screen. So those are some of the basics that I use with segues. Now let's talk about technique 2.1, which is the unwind segue. This is one of my favorite things in navigation. So an unwind segue provides a way to go back without having to use a delegate or having to do some other sort of calculation to figure out where you need to go back to. In a lot of cases, it's very easy if you present a modal view controller and you just dismiss it. That's real simple. If you have a more complex flow, and the example that we're going to show here has a pretty complex flow. So something like where you have multiple view controllers to achieve a task, right? So let's say you're creating a new account, and you've got to provide a name, an email, a phone number, favorite color, dog's name, all that kind of stuff. You want to add all that information, and then you want to be able to back through it. You want to be able to cancel from any point in there, and then when you finish, you want to be able to run validations, maybe set something up, and then go back with your account. That's a fairly complex flow, right? But you can do a lot of that back navigation without any code at all. So, or just basically one line of code. So we'll demonstrate how that works. All right, so the way that you implement an unwind segue is fairly simple. So you need to figure out the screen that you want to go back to, right? So this is the from screen. And what you do in that screen is you just, you need to make sure you have a custom subclass, so UI view controller subclass, and you add a method with this signature. And the name of the method can be anything you like. Typically, I like to use unwind at the beginning of it just as a naming convention so I know what it's doing. So you can unwind for login, unwind for account creation, unwind for account cancel, that sort of thing. And then it just needs to accept a parameter called segue, and that has to be an instance of UI storyboard segue. And when you put that in your code, then the storyboard is now aware that there's the potential to be able to unwind to that view. Now in your storyboard, on the screen that you've navigated to, you can control drag from any control in that view. So let's say you've got a button that you say you want to cancel, or a UI bar button item, anything like that. You can control drag from those to the exit icon, and then you'll be able to select that unwind method. So we're going to walk through and see how that looks. Let's do the example here. All right, we're going to switch to mirroring. You can see Xcode, excellent. That's all good. All right, so the first thing we mentioned is the from screen, right? So here I'm just calling that my main view controller. And here I've got two functions, unwind with new account and unwind login. And so that's all I had to do. And in a lot of cases, you can actually set that up and not put any code in there at all to facilitate the unwind segue. Here I wanted to know that I got a login, so now it's true and I can do some specific stuff on the screen. But you might not have to put any code in there at all. And in my home view controller, sort of like my menu view controller, I've got a couple more unwinds, and these will handle my cancellations. Okay? So I've got those method definitions set up. Now let's take a look at the storyboard. So here you can see I've got my main screen right there. You're able to see that. Let's zoom in on that. And then I've got this account flow down below. So here I'd be able to select whether I wanted to log in or go to my account flow. And then my account flow has got these screens that I was talking about. So I want to be able to cancel from each of these screens to go back here. Or when I finish, I want to be able to finish right there and then go back here and say that I created my account, right? And then that would help me navigate all the way back to this screen. So as you can imagine, you'd have to write quite a bit of code to handle this with delegates and all kinds of stuff. But with the unwind segues, you can do this just by selecting the controls. So let's take a look at how to do that. All right, so here's the first view controller in my account setup. And there's my cancel button. So I'm going to right-click on that, and you can see I've already set that unwind segue up. And you see that exit icon up there? Let's take a zoom look at that. So that's where you're able to set that up. I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and we'll re-add it. Okay? So I can do it two ways. I can right-click on this, and it shows me all the available unwind destinations, right? So this is going back up through the view hierarchy, so it knows all the available choices. And so I want to do my login cancel here. Right? I'm sorry, it's not a new login cancel, it's my account cancel. So I just drag it up there. Oops, I did that incorrectly. I just drag it to the control I want, and I wire it up. That's all there is to it. So you can do it also the other way. If I, let's get rid of that. And I'll just control drag from the cancel button, oops, to the exit, and then I can select the action segue there as well. All right. Now let's just take a look at how this looks. In the simulator. All right. So here's this flow. So you saw I've got my main view underneath. This is my sort of login or create new account. So now I select create new account. I can continue through these screens. I can go back. That's all navigation controller. All that's for free. There's no code there, right? So now all these cancel buttons are wired up. If I hit that, it goes right back to where I wanted. Now if I use my new account, I'm going to hit my done button here, and let's presume it does all the stuff I need to do to create a new account. I hit done, and it's navigated all the way back up to that main view, past my home view that does my login or account selection choice. So I did all of that back navigation with only 4 lines of code. So that's something I really appreciate about the unwind segue. So I encourage you to try that out in your apps. Oops. We don't need photos. Stop that. Okay. All right. Technique number 3, auto layout. Who loves auto layout? Who's lying? Auto layout's hard, right? Or sometimes it can be hard. But personally, I've spent a lot of time with it, and when I first started to learn it, I was really frustrated by it. It took me a long time to get it right. But now, after spending a couple of years with it, I can build stuff with auto layout faster than I could in code or with the springs and struts or any of that kind of stuff. So it's absolutely worth your time to get good at auto layout. Some pointers here. I don't have a lot of, because auto layout's a big topic, right? We could do entire talks on just that. But one of the things that I like to do is just minimize the number of constraints. So do the absolute minimum. Be lazy, right? Think about your views in terms of constraints, like how they relate to one another, how they relate to the larger super view, and just minimize the constraints. When you're in doubt, if something's not working properly, delete some constraints and add them back. It doesn't hurt anything. Spend some time understanding when you need constraints and when you don't. For example, as I got my throat clearing there, intrinsic content size. So when you're using a label or an image, you can leverage intrinsic content size to not have to do constraints, right? And just do your positioning constraints to put things in place. Sometimes some constraint priorities, if you're not familiar with those, can get you out of some tricky situations. We're going to look at an example here where we use a priority to do some animation. Last but not least, once you're in an auto layout world and you want to do some animation, animate the constraints, not the frames. All right, so let's take a quick look at an auto layout example. Now, this example, I actually was just working with a client recently. who wanted to, oops, I have to start that. I didn't do an unwind from my unwind example back to my menu, my example menu. So I'll have to restart the simulator there. All right, so I was working with the client, and what they wanted to do was have, the search bar, and this is all built in. The search bar is built in. You can use UI search bar. It's really robust. You can do a lot of cool stuff with it. But they wanted a custom search bar that would not only have the cancel button, like this does when I'm inside, whoops, it's got my cancel button, but they also wanted to be able to select some of the choices that came back after performing a search to be able to perform additional actions on them. So they wanted to have a show button so you could pick some stuff and then show it on another view. And that's not built in, right? So what I wanted to do was build this custom search bar that mimics what UI search bar does, but has the addition of this show button. So as you can see here, we've got this nice animation that toggles with that button. And that's what I would do if I had a search and I were selecting some stuff. And then I've got this cancel button that I can use. And then I forgot to put the little X in there in the search field, but we could put that in there as well. And you'll notice this animates as well. All right, so I did all that stuff just with auto layout. I have no frame calculations. This will resize on any device. It'll fit any device. There are no frame calculations in there. That's all auto layout. So let's take a look at how we did that. So the first thing I'm going to show you are some of the constraints that are in there. So here's the search bar. And you can see right there I've got a constraint that goes between this container view and my cancel button, right? So that's the one that positions that when the cancel button is visible. Now I've got another constraint in there that holds the search area, and I'm actually going to click on the show button. That's not going to show it very well. Oh, that didn't work either. So I'm going to select there's our container view. All right, so now you can see this dotted line. Does anybody know what that means? My constraint? Yeah. Priority, that's right. Yeah, so I used a lower priority for that constraint. And so all that does is when this constraint between this view and the cancel is not there, it falls back to this constraint. So all I did is set up outlets for that. So I've got an outlet, an IB outlet for that constraint, and all I do is activate it or inactivate it, right? So I make it active or not. So I turn that constraint on and off as I need it, and then auto layout does all the work for me. So that's a really, really simple approach where you can use auto layout, use priorities, and get a lot of functionality for not a lot of work. So that's auto layout. All right, I'm going to move that. All right, size classes. So size classes are kind of another really cool thing that Apple did. Size classes give you a relatively simple way to customize for all the variations of the iPhone sizes, for the iPad, portrait and landscape variations. Apple just basically abstracted that all away, so you don't have to think about portrait, you don't have to think about landscape. All you do is think about the size classes, right? So I recommend, to future-proof your app, that you use a universal storyboard and you use those square view controllers that I was using. So those are the any combination, right? So typically what I do is I'll start with any with my size classes, and then as we identify custom needs where screens need to be different based on certain size class combinations, then I'll customize those individually. I learned something here that was kind of painful. When I move from any, and it's really nice and easy. You can just take all that stuff that you've built in any, cut it, move to your other combination, paste it, wire up your external auto layout constraints. Everything should work great. Well, what I learned was that if you don't remove the constraints before you do that from the any, kind of to the outside or to the super view, it'll keep those constraints in there. All kinds of bad stuff happens. So if you do this customization, you create something in any, and you're going to move it into a custom combination, be sure to remove the constraints to the super view before you do that, and it'll save you a lot of pain. I see you nodding. You've done this before, right? Cool. All right. So I've got one little hint here with size class settings. This is one that I just found out about recently, and it kind of, it's one of those, oh, I'm a professional, I should have known this, right? But size class settings, there are certain attributes on certain UI kit components where you can specify size class settings in the inspector. And in this example, this is a label. And what I want to do with this label is on my phone sizes, I want it to be one font size. But if I'm on the iPad, I want it to be bigger so it stretches out across the top of the screen since it's a header. And so I want that to have a different font size. Well, what I'd done before in the past is, like in my view did load or my view did appear, I didn't sort of inspect, what's my current trait collection? Am I in regular? If so, then I've got some code to say, go change the font size, right? Well, somebody told me about this, and I'm like, it's very exciting. So let's take a quick example of what that looks like. All right, so I've got a very simple view. All right, so this is my very important numbers with a little table and some stuff here. So that's what it looks like on the phone, right? So that's 26-point system font. And if I come back over here and look at that, or 24-point system font, right? Now you can see that little plus sign right there. Anytime you get that little plus sign, that means you can use a custom size class combination, right? Or a custom size class setting for that attribute. So here you can add another one if you want, and then you can specify which combination you want, and then you can make the setting right there. So now what I've got here is if I look at the iPad, that's how it'll end up looking. That's the 48-point there. And all I did was just make that setting there, so that changed. So that took away several lines of code and is a much cleaner solution. This is why Apple folks at WWDC have two machines, right? So they can switch back and forth quickly. All right. All right, outlet collections. Who here has used outlet collections before? It's a good number of people? Cool. Well, I don't know if anybody noticed, but Adrian mentioned this when he was doing the accessibility talk, and he just showed he had a couple of outlet collections, and he was just able to loop over his labels, right, and add his accessibility traits. So outlet collections are really great for instances when you've got multiple sort of related interface elements that you need to do stuff with in code, but they're not necessarily grouped under the same super view. Because what you could always do is if you've got a bunch of stuff under the same super view, you can just say, get my subviews, iterate over those, and deal with them. Outlet collections give you a way to set this up in the storyboard so you can group related interface elements together and then perform tasks on them. So this example, where I had that stack view, or that the list of the related numbers, and my fonts are all kind of funny there when stuff resizes. What I like to do is just use those in an outlet collection, and then I'll do a check and say, hey, is this number too big? If so, I'm going to change the font size so they're all uniform, right? So that's kind of an example of something you can do with an outlet collection. So let's take a look at how to do that. Okay, so you can see here, for my revenue numbers, those numbers are pretty big, right? And they're auto-sizing. I'm letting the label sort of size itself based on the width and change the font. But you can notice this big number over here, yay, we got a lot of money, but it's not the same font size as the other ones. So that looks ugly. So what I've done is each of those fields belong to my outlet collection, right? So I created an outlet collection, and let's take a look at the source for that, what that looks like. So I've just got an IB outlet for an array of UI labels. And you can set that array to be whatever you want. If it's just, you could even do UI views, so you could put anything in there that wouldn't necessarily have to be the same type. But in this case, I know I'm working with labels. I know I want to perform a font change to them. So that's my whole purpose, right? So I just create this IB outlet, and I called it revenue labels. I've got that. And then back in my storyboard, I just take every field that I want, and I assign it to that IB outlet collection. And so if I had something else here that wasn't assigned to anything, you can use that new reference outlet collection, and it'll tell you what choices are available that'll work with that item. All right. So then what I can do is, now that I've done that, I'm going to do a check, and my view did appear, and I'm just going to look at how many characters I've got, and if it's too big, then I'll resize everything so that all those fonts are consistent across the view. So let's take a quick look at that. And I'd swear Xcode builds slower when you're in front of people. All right, now you can see when the view appeared, you can see that resize take place, right? So now those are all consistent, and all I did was loop over everything in that collection and set it to the same font size. So that's kind of an example of what you can do with an outlet collection. All right, next up, stack views. Who here uses stack views? You folks? Cool. All right, so stack views provide kind of a convenient way to organize and align subviews without having to do any auto layout work. So you can take a stack view, you can put a whole bunch of stuff in it, and in that example I had, several labels all together, and I was nesting stack views inside of stack views to make that stuff lay out in a tabular fashion. And there's no auto layout work at all needed. To do a stack view, you just place the stack view in your view, and you do have to do auto layout to figure out where the stack view goes and how big it is. But anything that you put inside, you just, in the inspector, you select how you want the stack view to lay out, whether it's vertical or horizontal. And then you can select, what kind of rules you do for lining stuff up. It can line stuff up on the left, center it, put it on the right, fill, use intrinsic content size. There's a lot of different options. So you can do a lot of layout very quickly and very easily with stack views. So let's take a look at an example of how to do that. Oh, I'm skipping ahead here. Yeah, so you can use them inside table cells to make columns really easy. So if you've got a table, like a table view, but you want to have some columns inside your cells, you can use a stack view inside your cells, and it'll consistently lay stuff out. So that's a really good technique. Then I use them inside collection view cells sometimes as well for easy layout, where you've got collections, cells that are going to lay out across the screen, and you want things inside those cells to line up properly as well. So a stack view can do that very, very quickly and easily. Last but not least, don't use them as a crutch. I see a lot of people that just do their entire layout with stack views and don't do any auto layout. That can be problematic because it can be a bit difficult for maintainability later on. All right, let's take a quick look at how to do a stack view. stopped that. All right, so what I've got here is I've got one big stack view here that's laid out horizontally, and then each of these is a stack view itself. And then I'm centering all those inside that. So let's look at how that works. So there you can see that what I just highlighted is the containing stack view around the side. And as you can see over here, that's a horizontal stack view. And I've told it to fill equally. So that way it'll size everything that's underneath it the exact same width. So that'll give me some nice table columns. Now underneath that, I've got these 4 stack views, and those each contain labels. So here I've selected the January one, and you can see that's a vertical stack view, and I use the exact same approach I told it to fill. So it's going to fill this way, and it's going to space them out the same way, so that way everything is always lined up. So that's just a quick look at how to do stack views. All right, table views. Now table views are really powerful. They've been around since the beginning of iOS, and there's a lot that you can do with them. So what are some things that we do with table views to make life easier? In Storyboards, one thing we always do, or I always do, is use prototype cells. So they work in both UI table view controllers and UI table views that are embedded in a UI view controller. I will also use a static table for stuff like a menu or things where you've just got static set of information, like a picker where you're choosing some options or stuff like that. So I just will very quickly create a static cells and just build those out, because then you don't even have to build a lot of those table view, delegate, and data source methods in your view controller. You can just leave them empty. But you do have to use nibs, unfortunately, to configure if you have custom table view headers and footers and section headers and footers. Someday, IB will support those, I hope. All right. So one technique that I like to use with the table view is auto-resizing table cells. Has anybody done this? Yep. Cool. This can really save you a lot of headache. So before iOS 8, implementing dynamic heights on table cells was really challenging. You had to calculate the cell height based on the values of the data that you had. So you'd have to do a bunch of math and figure out, how high, if I've got a label and an image and then another label, I'd have to do some calculations to figure out how high each of those labels were going to be, how far apart they were, how big that's going to make the cell, and then be able to report that back in my height for row and index path method, right? Well, iOS 8 added support for auto resizing. So it uses auto layout to calculate how big the cell is. So let's take a look at how to do that. So there's just a few steps that you need to do in order to make this work. The first one is, create your subclass of UI table view cell, and then you set up the prototype cell in the storyboard and use your auto layout constraints to make sure there's a clear calculation, a clear vertical calculation that'll yield your height for the table view cell. For anything that you've got expanding, like an expanding label, set your lines to 0. And then you need to implement the estimated height for row and index path inside your view controller that's handling the table. If you run into problems, double check that you've told the table view it's default, but the row height should be set to UI table view automatic dimension. That is the default. I've had to set it sometimes because the default just didn't work for whatever reason. But yeah, that's something to check. So let's take a quick look at how to do that. Okay, so here is my auto resizing table view, right? I've got a prototype cell here, I've got a label, and this label I've got set up so that it'll stretch all the way across and then stop at the margin. And it's a certain height from the bottom and a certain height from the top. And then I've got a button in here as well that I want to maintain its position. So if I look at the label, and I can look at the constraints that I've got for it. Oops, where are my constraints? There we are. Yep, so I've got a bottom space and a top space. And so that's all I need to do to get from the top of the content view to the bottom of the content view. So now it's got an explicit way to calculate how tall that's going to be. So I give that label some data, and it knows, well, I'm going to size the label for that data, and I'm going to add the top constraint, add the bottom constraint. And you can actually get more complex than this. You can have stuff in between, and as long as you've got a nice, clear vertical calculation, the table view will be able to do this automatically. So now that I've got all that set up, and I'm going to take a quick look at my view controller. So here's a bunch of the test strings that I'm going to look at. And you can see my data source and delegate is really, really simple, right? I have my estimated height, which I'm just guessing is sort of a middle height, 74 points. I'm dequeuing my cell, and all I'm doing is setting my string. And I've got my number of rows. That's all I need in there. So I've got a minimal amount of code to do this. As you can see there, auto layout is doing all the work for me. So each of these cells with the longer and longer values is stretching out to do the right thing. So that's just a real quick look at how to do auto cell resizing in a table view. All right, collection views. Collection views are one of my favorite things. So I was working on a project several years ago before collection views existed, and it was a very sort of challenging photo layout app. And so one of the guys that was working with me, he and I, we had to be able to display up to 5,000 images on an iPhone 3 and be able to scroll like this. The client wanted to be able to go like that and have it not stutter, right? Yeah, you guys are laughing because it was a pain. So we ended up basically implementing collection view. One of the guys that I worked with, he spent all kinds of time, figured it out, modeled it after table collection or table view controller, and we got this working. Took us a couple of months to write it. We finally got it to be really, really butter smooth. And then we went to WWDC. We're sitting together during the State of the Union, and they announced collection view, and we're both like, oh no, that would have been a lot easier. So collection view is wonderful. It's powerful. I definitely suggest you use it. But here's a couple of tips that I use for these. So definitely configure your view on a storyboard, even if you've got a custom layout, because you can specify that custom layout in the storyboard. Build prototype cells. You can do a lot with prototype cells. I've even kind of done my own sort of custom sizing with prototype cells as well, using auto layout. It's not as easy as the auto resizing in the table view, but you can still do it. And then last but not least, you actually can create custom collection view section headers and footers in Interface Builder, in the storyboard. And again, I just wish that worked for tables too. Hint, hint, Apple, please do that. So let's take just a quick look at a collection view. All right, so there's a really, really simple collection view. Whoops. Didn't mirror, sorry. All righty, so there is a very, very simple collection view. Now, as you can see here, I'm hovering over the layout, and right now I've got it set to flow layout. But if you had a custom layout, you could just select custom here and then put the layout in that you're using for it. And what will happen is this reference to the flow layout will turn into a custom thing that'll specify your class. And so with a flow layout, you can change vertical to horizontal right here. All right, so I've got my custom cells. I've got those built. Now these, that's my custom header. And then I've got a custom footer down there at the bottom. And so those have each got labels, and I can style them and make them look any way I want. So I can do a lot of that stuff in code, and then you just configure it with your data as you're setting up the collection view. And so yeah, if you look at the custom cell, all I'm doing is I've just got a title label that I populate with some data. Oops. And then my controller is actually pretty simple. I've got a bunch of sample data. I'm telling it how many sections I've got, telling it what I want to put in there, the number of sections, the number of cells, and then I just customize them all. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Yeah, so I've got all the letters of the alphabet, some numbers, and I've got some emoji in there. So just really simple. And so if you're using collection views and you're not doing anything really crazy with your layout, doing it in Storyboard is a really good way to do it and save yourself a lot of code. All right, on time, okay. Storyboard references. So storyboards, people that hate storyboards, one of the complaints is that they just get gigantic, right? You have so many views in there, it gets really hard to scroll around, you can't find stuff, and then it gets kind of messy too, right? When you're trying to like squeeze stuff together or make it all fit and line it all up. So they can quickly get large, unwieldy, hard to maintain. So one thing you can do is use storyboard references to break these storyboards into logical groups. And then you can even use storyboard references to allow segues across storyboards, between storyboards. So let's take a look at how to use storyboard references to sort of make your storyboards manageable and less painful. All right, so in my main storyboard here, so this is all I've got for this example app that I've been showing. So I've got embedded in a navigation controller a table view with just some static cells, right? And then each of those segues goes off to another storyboard, right? So that's really, really simple. And that's just a storyboard reference. So what you do is you just drag that storyboard reference onto the storyboard canvas. You can create your segue just like you'd create a segue in any other way. And then you can customize that storyboard reference to say which storyboard it is. And you can even say, you can use the default, the initial view controller, or you can specify which view controller you want to go to from that reference. So there really aren't any constraints. Once you're doing these segues, you can do a lot with these storyboard references just as if they were screens in your storyboard. Now let's take another look at something here, which is, this is messy. I've got these two extra screens here at the bottom and they're ugly and I don't want them in my storyboard anymore. So I'm going to do that. I selected them. I'm going to go up to Editor. I'm going to say Refactor to Storyboard. I'm going to call that my Refactor Storyboard. And watch that. Okay, did you see what happened there? Oh, geez. So this created a new storyboard with the two view controllers that I selected. And if I go back to my main storyboard, it kept the segue that I had to the original view and replaced it with a storyboard reference. So if you've got a big, ugly storyboard, take a few minutes, refactor it like that. You'll notice you can do that in about 15 minutes, and you'll be very happy. So that's storyboard references. All right. So gesture recognizers. I love gesture recognizers too. Gesture recognizers don't really take that much code to set up, but I see a lot of people just set them up in code. But they are really, really, really easy to set up in a storyboard and customize. And you don't need any code at all. So, I mean, maybe you'll say 3 lines of code, 4 lines of code, but it's 3 lines of code, 4 lines of code. That adds up, right? So, to do a gesture recognizer, you just drag the gesture recognizer you want to the view you want to associate it with and drop it. You configure your parameters in the inspector, you know, how many taps you need, you know, what your panning constraints are, that kind of stuff. And then you just create and implement your recognizer method and function, attach it like any other IB action. And it's just that easy. All right. We'll take a quick look at that. All right, you can see here I've got a gesture recognizer, a tap gesture recognizer, and I've got the method set up for it. So all I did for this is when I highlight it, you can see it's attached to this little view, the blue view there, and I've got it set up to that received method. So all I had to do was find the tap gesture recognizer, say that 3 times fast, take it from here, you drag it over to the view you want and drop it, and then you get the reference to it up there in your storyboard, and you can configure it and maintain it. So no code at all necessary, just a really easy way to set those up. All right, last but not least, this is the fun part of the presentation. Merge conflicts, yay. Everybody loves them, right? They make me want to jump off this dam, right? They're just so painful. All right, so why do we have merge conflicts? Well, the basic explanation is storyboards are XML documents, right? So they're just these big chunks of XML that describe what you're seeing on the board. Now, they're machine generated, right? But they are pretty easy to read. So what happens is when you do stuff, 2 people are doing things in the storyboard. They submit their changes. They're in the same place in the document. Git doesn't know what to do. That's why you get a merge conflict. So there are 5 different general areas where you get merge conflicts. 4 of them are easy to deal with. 1 of them is not. So typically, you'll have a document info conflict. When Interface Builder automatically changes your storyboard, you know, just because you looked at it, it's like, oh, I'm changed. Resources section, multiple new scenes, and then editing the same scene. We'll talk about each of those and how you deal with them. So when you get the merge conflict with the document info and automatic changes, this one's really, really simple. The document info is just caused by different Xcode versions, so you're going to see those in the code. You pick one, move on. It doesn't matter. The same thing is true with your automatic changes. A lot of times this will be, you know, if somebody opened up a storyboard on a Retina machine and then somebody else opened it up on a non-Retina machine, things will lay out a little differently. That's one cause. Anytime it's rerunning your auto layout to position stuff on the screen, it'll do an automatic change. So that's what happens a lot of the times when you get those changes just by looking at the layout. The easiest solution is when stuff like that happens and you're not actually changing the storyboard, don't commit the changes. That's the easiest way to avoid a conflict. If they are real changes and you committed them, just pick the newer ones, merge, move on, right? It's not the end of the world. But beware of the initial view controller change. You can get yourself in trouble if somebody has changed the initial view controller and you merge it and you don't realize it and then your app doesn't work. So just be aware of that. Okay, resources section. This is caused when 2 people add new images and use them in the storyboard. So let's say I've added a couple of images, you know, for buttons or whatever, and you know you're working on one screen, you're working on the other screen. We add those in the asset section, and then we put them in the storyboard. Now there's no conflict between your screens and your changes, but since there are new things in the resources section, they conflict. That one's pretty easy. All you do is take a look at it just like an Xcode project merge when you get two new files, right, and those conflict. You just do one after the other. The order doesn't matter. Merge it, move on. Everything's happy. All right. Multiple new scenes. This is a fun one. So this happens when two people add new scenes and they end up in the same place in the document. So this is, you create a new scene, you create a new scene. They end up in the same place in the document, and then you get a conflict. When you can identify that, you can do the same thing with the merge. Just do one scene first, the other scene afterwards. Make sure the XML is nice and clean, and then it'll pass. Load up that storyboard after the merge. Make sure you didn't mess it up, right? All right, so the one that everybody hates is the editing the same scene. So this happens when two people are editing stuff in the same view controller. This one's very, very difficult to merge properly. Yeah, the best option in my mind is really just to coordinate changes. So if you know for a ticket, somebody's got to change a screen, make sure that you coordinate those changes, right? So that you're not doing this, or you're not actually creating the merge conflict. If you absolutely have to merge, what I typically do is you merge the first feature branch into your parent, so your developer or whatever like that, and then merge from develop into the second feature branch and sort it out there. You may end up having to toss some of the initial changes or toss your changes and add them back in. It's painful, but it's less painful than breaking the XML in your storyboard, right? And trying to figure out what's going on there. Luckily, if you saw Laura's thing on Git, you can you can back up when you do break it and go back to something that works, reapply the changes, and keep moving. I've got 2 minutes left here. I kind of wanted to show an example of this merge conflict and just how to identify them. So let's do that very, very quickly. Yeah, see, all my storyboards that I looked at got changed. So we're going to toss all those changes. I'm going to switch to this branch. Oops, I have uncommitted changes. No, I don't. Oh, that's because I'm still in the storyboard. Supposedly this is fixed in Xcode 8. Has anybody proven that or not? I haven't installed Xcode 8 yet, so I don't know. Okay, let's take a quick look. So I'm going to merge some changes to one scene. And we're going to get a conflict, and we're going to see how it looks, right? Okay. So here's my merge conflict, or my comparison view. And in the case when you get a document change, you'll just see it up there, and you'll be able to deal with it very easily. So you can look for that, and you'll see the conflict there. And then you can just kind of scroll around on this side and see where the differences are. And you can see those are changes that it's able to deal with. Uh-oh. Ha! You know what? I think I messed up my merge, and I actually I fixed the problem that I had before with my examples. So this is going to be a dead egg of a demo. The demo gods strike again. All right. I can show you one other merge issue. Yeah, so there's the minimal change conflict, and you can just see where it is. It highlights what the version difference is, and that's easy. You just pick which one you want. All right. So that's it on merge conflicts. And that's what I've got for today. So first off, I'd like to thank the folks from Salt Marsh for putting on an excellent conference, and thank everyone for coming here. We appreciate it. Thank you.